The arrogant smirk of the cop carried a weight heavier than words, a silent insult wrapped in the folds of prejudice and false superiority. It was not just a fleeting curve of the lips but a reflection of an entire mindset that had been nurtured over time, one that thrived on the belief that uniforms and badges gave certain men the license to look down on others. That smirk told a story without speaking a single word. It was the kind of smirk that said, "I hold power over you," a gesture meant to diminish the dignity of the man standing before him. The officer believed his authority was absolute, and his arrogance oozed through every glance, every slight tilt of his head, as if mocking the very idea of respect. He did not see the decorated general as a man who had given his life in service to the country, nor as someone who had endured years of sacrifice to uphold the very freedoms the officer took for granted. Instead, he saw only skin, only color, only a target for his disdain, and that smirk was his weapon of choice. It was more piercing than words, for it communicated a disdain that could not be misunderstood. The courtroom carried its own silence, yet the cop's smirk seemed to echo across the room, an invisible taunt directed at the man whose quiet presence carried far more weight than any outward display of arrogance. The officer's body language was a script in itself, one that revealed his inner thoughts more than he realized. A slight squint of the eyes, a tightening of his jaw, a deliberate pause before his smirk widened, all of it carefully designed to send one message, that he was superior. The irony was thick, because true strength has never been measured in the tilt of a mouth or the curl of a lip. Yet, in his arrogance, the officer believed he was untouchable. He thought no one would challenge the casual cruelty behind his expression, and so he wore it like armor, a shield to mask his own insecurities. The general, however, did not respond in kind. His silence was not weakness but discipline, the kind that had been forged over decades of commanding men, facing battles, and navigating a world where respect was earned through action, not demanded through authority. But the cop failed to see that. In his mind, respect was transactional, a currency reserved for those he chose to acknowledge. The smirk was his refusal to pay that respect, a signal that he believed the general unworthy of even basic courtesy. That arrogance was rooted not in strength but in ignorance, for a man who truly understood power would know that real authority requires no smirk, no mockery, no belittling gestures. Every smirk, every silent chuckle behind closed lips, carried with it a history that stretched far beyond that moment in the courtroom. It carried the echoes of a society where men in uniform had often been allowed to act as judge, jury, and executioner, where arrogance was not just tolerated but sometimes celebrated. The cop, in that single expression, was not just mocking one man, he was mocking an entire legacy of struggle, of perseverance, of battles fought not on foreign soil but within the very streets he patrolled. His smirk was an inheritance of a mindset that refused to die, one that cloaked itself in law and order while quietly feeding on prejudice. Yet, beneath the surface, arrogance has a way of blinding those who carry it. The officer was too absorbed in his own display to recognize the quiet storm standing before him. He did not see the calm restraint in the general's eyes, nor the strength in his stillness. He did not understand that the man he mocked had faced enemies far fiercer than a courtroom full of whispers, had endured challenges that would break lesser men. But arrogance rarely sees the full picture, it thrives in narrow visions, in small-minded triumphs, in fleeting moments of perceived dominance. And so, the officer clung to his smirk, convinced it was a crown upon his head, unaware it was the very mask that would soon betray him. The silent strength of the black general was not something that needed to be announced or displayed with grandeur, it was felt the moment he stepped into the room. His presence was calm yet commanding, the kind of aura that comes only from years of discipline, sacrifice, and living through trials that tested every fiber of his being. He did not need to raise his voice, nor did he need to assert himself with force or arrogance. The silence he carried was louder than the jeers, the smirks, and the unspoken prejudices that surrounded him. It was the kind of silence that unsettled those who mistook quietness for weakness, for it held within it the weight of battles fought, lives led, and a legacy earned through blood and perseverance. The general knew that true authority was never about outward displays, it was about the quiet control one has over themselves, even when the world seeks to strip them of their dignity. As the officer smirked, mocking in his arrogance, the general did not flinch. He did not offer a return glance of anger or frustration. Instead, he remained still, his face composed, his eyes steady. It was a silence born not out of fear but out of wisdom, a silence that said he had seen worse, endured worse, and conquered far greater enemies than the smirk of a prejudiced man. This strength, invisible to those who judged only by appearances, was the very foundation of his character. It was not something that could be taught in a classroom or handed down with a badge or a title. It was forged in moments of pain, in times when respect was denied, in trials where only perseverance could keep a man standing. There is a particular power in silence that unsettles the arrogant. They expect retaliation, anger, or even submission, but when met with composure instead, they grow restless. The general's quiet strength was a mirror, reflecting back the insecurity hidden behind the cop's smirk. Every second of stillness became a silent reminder that the officer's mockery had no effect, that his attempt to belittle was powerless against someone who knew his own worth. The courtroom might have been filled with tension, but the calmness of the general cut through it, reminding everyone that true strength does not always announce itself in noise. Sometimes, it simply sits quietly, unbothered, waiting for the right moment to reveal its depth. This silent strength was not just personal, it was symbolic. It represented generations of men and women who had endured injustice, who had been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed, yet stood tall despite it all. The general carried that legacy with him, even in silence. Every pause, every breath, every calm gesture was a continuation of a story larger than himself. His restraint was not just about maintaining his own dignity, it was about honoring those who had come before him, those who had endured the same smirks, the same ridicule, but refused to bow their heads. His silence was an act of defiance wrapped in composure, a refusal to give the officer the satisfaction of reaction. What the officer failed to realize was that the general's quietness was not emptiness, it was calculation. It was the kind of silence that speaks of patience, of waiting for the right moment, of understanding that not every battle is fought with words or immediate action. Sometimes, the greatest power lies in knowing when not to respond, in letting arrogance dig its own grave. The general's stillness was the strength of a man who had led men into wars, who had made decisions where lives hung in the balance, who had carried responsibilities far heavier than the petty arrogance of one man in uniform. His silence was not absence of power, it was the very embodiment of it. To those watching, his silence may have seemed passive, but to those who understood strength, it was unmistakable. It was the kind of strength that made the air heavy, that shifted the atmosphere of the room, that forced people to reckon with the reality that true authority needs no performance. The general did not have to prove himself to anyone in that courtroom, least of all to a man whose arrogance was rooted in prejudice. He had nothing to gain by responding and nothing to lose by remaining still. His silence was his shield, and behind it stood decades of experience, resilience, and unshakable dignity. Subtle racism often hides behind gestures so small they are easy to dismiss, but for the person on the receiving end, those gestures weigh heavily and unmistakably. In that courtroom, the cop's mockery was not delivered through open insults or outright confrontation. It came through glances, smirks, the deliberate raising of an eyebrow, the quiet chuckle under his breath. These small actions were designed to sting without ever needing to be spoken aloud, calculated to degrade while still maintaining the illusion of professionalism. That is the cruel trick of subtle racism, it disguises itself as harmless behavior, as if the one being mocked is imagining it, while the one delivering it hides behind denial. The cop's smirk was not just arrogance, it was an unspoken message rooted in prejudice, a reminder that he saw the general not as an equal, not as a decorated soldier, but as someone unworthy of respect because of the color of his skin. In a room full of people, subtle racism thrives because it avoids the direct spotlight. It becomes the smirk that only one person notices, the whisper spoken just loud enough for its target to hear, the body language that speaks louder than words yet is easy to brush off when called out. The cop thought himself clever for masking his prejudice in this way. He knew he could always retreat to excuses if challenged, it was just a smile, or I didn't mean anything by it. But the truth is, those small gestures carry centuries of history, years of systemic dismissal and disrespect. They are not harmless, they are sharpened blades meant to cut quietly, leaving wounds others may not see but that linger all the same. The general recognized it for what it was. He had lived long enough to know that racism does not always scream in your face, sometimes it whispers, taunts, and sneers, hoping to erode your dignity without drawing too much attention. Subtle racism thrives on plausible deniability, and that was the shield the cop thought he was hiding behind. He wore his smirk as if it were invisible, unaware that the man before him had faced down far more dangerous enemies who used far sharper weapons. The general understood that the cop's behavior was not just about him personally, it was about a mindset that ran deep, a reflection of the belief that authority could be used as a tool to degrade, as if mocking a man's very identity was part of the job. Every small act of mockery added weight to the room. The smirk turned into a shadow that hung over the courtroom, noticed by some but ignored by others. That is how subtle racism sustains itself, not because it goes unseen, but because those who do see it often choose silence. In that silence, the cop believed he had won some invisible battle. He thought his smirk made him untouchable, that it would chip away at the general's composure. What he did not realize was that the general's silence was not submission but restraint, and every moment he held himself with dignity, he only exposed the cop's pettiness further. Subtle racism is dangerous precisely because of how it operates. It makes its victims question themselves, forces them to wonder if speaking up will make them look overly sensitive or irrational. It wears down confidence, piece by piece, until its impact is undeniable. The officer's mockery may have seemed small in the grand scheme of things, but in reality, it was an act of violence against respect. It was a rejection of the general's humanity, wrapped in a smile that others might call meaningless. That is the insidious nature of prejudice. It convinces the perpetrator that their actions are too small to matter, while convincing the victim that their pain may not be worth voicing. The general, however, knew better. He had faced subtle racism before, in classrooms, in barracks, in neighborhoods, and in institutions that promised equality but delivered something far less. Each time, he had carried himself with the same silent strength, understanding that the world was watching not just what was being done to him, but how he chose to respond. The cop may have believed his smirk was invisible, but the truth was, it illuminated his prejudice for all who cared to see. What he intended as a quiet insult became a glaring reflection of his own character, not the general's. The phone call was not loud, nor was it dramatic in the way movies often portray turning points. It was quiet, almost ordinary, just the sound of a man dialing a number with steady hands and calm composure. Yet in that silence, the entire atmosphere of the courtroom began to shift. What seemed like a simple action carried with it the weight of unseen authority, the kind that does not need to be flaunted but reveals itself in the right moment. The officer who had spent the morning smirking, mocking, and reveling in his arrogance had no idea that a single call could unravel the entire facade of power he thought he owned. He believed himself untouchable, his badge and uniform a shield that allowed him to disrespect without consequence. But authority is not always what it seems, and that phone call was about to prove it. As the general held the phone to his ear, his demeanor did not change. He did not raise his voice, did not seek to embarrass or expose anyone directly. He simply spoke in the same calm, steady tone he had carried with him since the moment he entered the room. To the casual observer, it may have looked like nothing at all, a routine call, a mundane action, but beneath the surface, the foundations of arrogance were beginning to crack. The officer's smirk lingered for a moment longer, but doubt began to creep into his expression. He shifted in his seat, uneasy, as though a shadow of realization flickered across his mind. It was in that moment he began to sense that perhaps this man he had mocked was not who he thought he was. The call connected not to an ordinary friend, not to a minor contact, but to someone whose authority eclipsed everything the officer thought he represented. On the other end of the line was a voice that carried more weight than his badge ever could. The general's words were simple, measured, almost casual, but every syllable seemed to hang in the air with an invisible force. Those listening might not have known exactly what was being said, but they could feel it, the quiet exchange of power, the unseen hand that was rearranging the balance of respect in that room. It was the kind of moment that reminds everyone watching that true influence is often invisible until it chooses to reveal itself. For the officer, the shift was almost unbearable. The arrogance that once carried him now felt heavy, dragging him down as reality set in. He watched the general's calm composure, realizing that the silence he had mistaken for weakness was actually patience. The phone call made that truth undeniable. Each second of that conversation chipped away at the officer's smirk, until what was left was not superiority but fear, not confidence but exposure. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closer, as though the very space had turned against him. The general had not raised his voice, had not retaliated with insults, but with one quiet action he had turned the tables completely. The call was not just about authority, it was about respect. It revealed that the general had access to levels of power and recognition the officer could never reach, no matter how much he relied on his uniform. The man he had mocked, the one he thought he could belittle without consequence, was in fact someone whose word carried far beyond that courtroom. The call exposed the fragile foundation of the officer's arrogance. He had mistaken cruelty for strength, mockery for control, but in the presence of true authority, his mask began to crumble. The courtroom could sense it too. The silence that followed was thick, charged, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing the unraveling of false power. The officer sat still, his smirk now gone, replaced by unease he could no longer hide. The phone call had stripped him of the illusion he had clung to. The general remained composed, still the same man he had been before the call, but the perception of him had shifted entirely. Where once the officer had tried to cast him as lesser, the truth now stood tall and undeniable. The call had not just changed the balance of power in the room, it had revealed it for what it truly was. Shock has a way of creeping into a room slowly at first, then crashing down all at once when reality can no longer be ignored. In that courtroom, the shift was almost visible. Moments before, the air had been thick with the officer's arrogance, his smirk a constant reminder of the prejudice that lingered beneath the surface. But as the phone call ended and the weight of what had just happened began to sink in, the expressions around the room changed. Whispers fell silent, eyes widened, and the stillness grew heavy, pressing down on everyone present. The officer who had once basked in the sound of his own quiet mockery was now the one under the gaze of the crowd, his confidence unraveling in front of the very people he had hoped to impress. What he thought would be another display of his unchecked authority had suddenly turned into the very stage of his humiliation. It was not a dramatic outburst or a loud confrontation that created the shock, it was the simplicity of the truth revealed. The general, who had remained silent and composed through every insult, now stood elevated in the eyes of everyone present, not by his own doing, but by the collapse of the officer's false sense of superiority. The contrast between the two men could not have been clearer. One had relied on arrogance, prejudice, and mockery to assert himself, while the other had relied only on patience, discipline, and dignity. And when the tables turned, it was not the loudest man in the room who commanded respect, but the quietest. The realization struck not just the officer but everyone watching: respect cannot be taken, it must be earned, and arrogance will always falter in the face of truth. The officer's face betrayed him. The smirk that once curved his lips had vanished, replaced by a tightness around his jaw and eyes that darted nervously, searching for a way to reclaim the control he had lost. But there was none. His authority, once assumed to be absolute, now seemed paper-thin, fragile against the calm strength of the general. Each second of silence after the call deepened the shock, as though the very walls of the courtroom were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer shifted uncomfortably, but there was no escape from the reality that had been laid bare before him. The shock waves were not confined to him alone, they spread to everyone watching, forcing each person to confront what they had just witnessed. For some, the shock was humbling. They saw in that moment how easily arrogance could crumble when confronted with true power carried with dignity. They realized that the man who had been mocked was not just any man, but a leader, a general whose presence demanded respect whether it was given willingly or not. For others, the shock was unsettling. It revealed how quickly the dynamics of power could change, how fragile the illusion of control really was, and how dangerous it is to underestimate those who remain silent. The phone call had shifted the ground beneath them all, exposing the truth that had been there all along but ignored until it could no longer be denied. The officer, once so sure of himself, now found the room colder, the silence louder, the stares sharper. What he thought would be a day of dominance had turned into a lesson written across his own face for all to see. The shock was not just his own, it was shared by everyone who realized they had been witness to arrogance being dismantled, not with anger or aggression, but with composure and quiet strength. That contrast made the moment even more powerful. It was not the kind of shock that fades quickly, it was the kind that lingers, the kind that changes the way people think, the kind that forces reflection long after the moment has passed. The shock that spread through the courtroom was more than just surprise, it was a reckoning. It was the sudden awareness that the roles had been reversed, that the man who had been ridiculed was the one who now commanded the room, and the one who had ridiculed him was left small, exposed, and without defense. It was the moment when arrogance finally collided with truth, and the result was undeniable. Respect is a word often thrown around, demanded loudly by those who wear uniforms, wield authority, or hold positions of power. But in truth, respect is not something that can be forced from others, it is something that must be earned through action, integrity, and character. In that courtroom, this truth revealed itself more clearly than any speech could have. The officer who had leaned so heavily on his badge, on his smirk, on the shallow arrogance of his position, believed respect came automatically with the authority stitched into his uniform. He thought others owed it to him, that his presence alone was enough to demand it. Yet, the more he mocked, the more he revealed the emptiness of his authority. His smirk did not inspire respect, it inspired discomfort, resentment, and quiet judgment from those who saw through it. What he failed to grasp was that respect is never about the symbols a man carries, it is about the weight of his character when those symbols are stripped away. The black general understood this better than anyone. He did not need to raise his voice, did not need to boast about his service, did not need to announce his achievements to the room. His silence alone carried more dignity than the officer's entire performance. The general had spent his life earning respect the hard way, through sacrifice, through discipline, through choosing honor even when others denied it to him. Every scar he bore, every sleepless night endured, every soldier he had led was a testament to the kind of respect that cannot be demanded but is freely given by those who witness true leadership. He did not need to ask for it, because it was already his. The officer's downfall was not just in his arrogance but in his misunderstanding of what respect really meant. He believed it was a prize that came with his position, something he could hold over others. But positions change, badges tarnish, uniforms wear out. What remains is the measure of a man, and in that measure, he was lacking. The general, on the other hand, stood as proof that respect grows not from symbols but from substance. His patience, his composure, and his quiet strength in the face of mockery earned him far more admiration than the officer could ever command with all his posturing. The phone call was the moment that made this truth undeniable, but it had been there all along. Respect cannot be demanded because it does not respond to force. It responds to humility, to honor, to the choices a man makes when others are watching and when they are not. The general's decision to remain composed in the face of disrespect was not just self-control, it was a display of the very quality that earns respect. He understood that lowering himself to meet the officer's arrogance would serve no one. By standing tall in silence, he showed that he was above the petty attempts to diminish him. That was the moment the courtroom realized who truly deserved respect, and it was not the man wearing the smirk. For those watching, the contrast was impossible to ignore. They saw that the man who had tried to demand respect through intimidation ended up losing it entirely. They saw that the man who had given respect even when it was denied to him left the room with more dignity than when he entered. It was a lesson written in real time, a reminder that respect, once lost, cannot be reclaimed with power or titles. It can only be rebuilt with humility, if at all. And in that moment, the officer's arrogance left him stripped of it completely. The lesson lingered in the air long after the smirk had faded. Respect is not about who shouts the loudest, who wears the most decorated uniform, or who holds the highest seat in the room. It is about the integrity one carries, the way one treats others, the dignity one maintains even when disrespected. The black general embodied that truth with every calm breath he took, while the officer exposed his ignorance with every mocking glance. The difference between them was stark, and it was clear to all who truly deserved to be respected.